This is Jay Callahan again. This is another one of our video mini lectures. And in this video, I want to talk about what I call the case of the airline mechanic. And this refers back to a couple of videos before when I spoke about the factors in the event and the factors in the individual that influence how a traumatic event impacts a person. And if you recall, one of the characteristics of the event was the sights, sounds, and smells. Very powerful. And in that, as an example, I talked about Northwest Flight 255, which crashed outside of Detroit in 1987. And so this is kind of a follow-up, in a sense, to that same situation. So this plane crash did happen. Oh yeah, that's right. And I want to also mention that one of the insights, or one of the important characteristics of this case, is the power of meaning. Right? Coping, support, and meaning. But meaning can be very powerful, and we will see in this example how meaning seems to have changed the whole event for people. So after the crash of Flight 255, a few days later, and I don't know really how he got my number, but I received a call from a guy who said that he was a mechanic for Northwest Airlines, and that he had been on duty that day, and in fact had been one of the first people to go to the scene of the crash. And later, though, however, he got into an argument with his manager, and it was a difficult situation, and the manager said that he had to go and see someone in order to be able to return to work, that the mechanic was angry, or at least annoyed. And the supervisor said that he had to get clearance from a mental health professional before he could come back to work. So the story that he told me, which I'm jumping ahead a little bit here, had a striking lack of trauma symptoms, was that he was on duty that day in the Northwest hangar, which just happened to be on the side of the airport nearest where the plane went down. And he and another guy were working in the hangar, and all of a sudden they heard this horrendous crash and explosion, and they knew what it was right away. They ran outside and got into a truck and drove down the access road, and they were able to get to the scene of the crash within a few minutes, before many of the first responders had arrived. And my client, the mechanic who became my client, said that he was driving the truck. The other guy, another mechanic, was with him. And as they got close to the scene, the other guy said, "Whoa, wait a minute, I'm not going there, I'm not going there, let me out. And he got out of the truck and walked back to the hangar. And meanwhile, the mechanic who became my client continued onto the site, where he described pretty much what I told you before, that the place looked like hell, that it was twilight by then, the red and blue lights, the numerous small fires, and as the first responders arrived and they began covering up the bodies and the body parts with these yellow blankets, then that sort of added an eerie sense to the whole scene. And he said it was very eerie and creepy, and that it was also very frustrating that there was nothing he could do, nothing any of them could do. There were no survivors, although I think I mentioned to you before, one little girl survived, but otherwise nobody survived. So there was nothing that rescuers and first responders can do, which is very striking and very, very impactful. And he said, so he went back to work, and later got into an argument with his supervisor, and who sent him home that day. And he said, and this is maybe 3 days after the crash, and he said that first night when I went home, I had trouble sleeping. But the next day, I was kind of okay, and I had no trouble sleeping that night. And then I think there was one more night, the night before he came to see me, when he also said that he didn't have any trouble sleeping. And so in the interview, as he told me his story, then I began to ask him about the symptoms of traumatic stress, the same ones we've talked about here in class. And again, if we were in class in person, I would ask you to name the 5 symptom clusters for traumatic stress. Remember, intrusive symptoms is one of them, and I'm hoping you can name off the other 4 right now. So I began asking him about those things, and he had a striking lack of trauma symptoms. He had trouble sleeping for only one night. He had no flashbacks. He had no weird experiences that happened to him, so he had no dissociative symptoms. He was not avoiding anything. He didn't seem overly aroused or nervous or jumpy or jittery. He didn't necessarily have negative mood or affect. And at first, when he started telling me this, I thought he was just kind of defensive and in denial. And, I thought I knew what happened in that, if you recall, I said that his manager said that he had been irritable and angry and he had to go get some help before he could come back to work. So I thought, well, that's pretty straightforward. He was traumatized. This is my thought at the beginning of the interview. This guy is traumatized by what he saw at the crash site. And trauma like that often makes people angry and irritable. It just seems to be a common after effect. And that was what was going on with his supervisor, and then why he was sent to see somebody, which turned out to be me. But as he went on, and he denied all these symptoms, and as he told the story, I began to believe him. He was pretty convincing, and as he described how he was doing, it pretty much became clear that he was telling the truth, that he was not in denial, and he had a genuine lack of trauma symptoms. So we sort of turned our attention to, well, isn't that surprising? Why doesn't he have more trauma symptoms? And he told me he thought, well, maybe one reason was that he had been a paramedic for several years in another city, a fairly big city, and he said that he had cleaned up his share of bad traffic accidents in which people had died or people had been badly injured. So maybe it was his experience as a paramedic that made him not as traumatized as many other people at this horrendous plane crash. But on the other hand, if you recall maybe from the other video, that the specifics that I learned about the crash site were from some police officers and paramedics that I knew in Ann Arbor, and they were pretty hardcore too. They had had lots of experience with lots of difficult cases, and they were freaked out and traumatized. So his story about having been a paramedic in the past didn't seem to be enough to explain it. But as we talked, he also told me another story, which began to be, I think, the real story here. And that was that he said he had learned to be a mechanic, an airline mechanic in the military. And he recalled the training in the military that he received. And he said he recalled at the beginning of the training in a big room at the air base where they were trained, they had a room of maybe 30 soldiers who were going to be in training to be pilots, and maybe 30 soldiers who were going to be in training to be mechanics. And they met all together on the first day, and the base commander welcomed them, and blah, 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 all the kind of introductory things. But when, as the meeting went on, one of the things that was brought up by, I believe it was the head pilot trainer, was that he said, I'm very happy to have all you guys, it was all men, all you guys here. Remember this is 35 years ago. Have all you here. Your safety in the training that we're going to provide, your safety is our utmost concern. But I have to tell you that no matter how careful we are, and we are very careful, we do everything we can. But if you 30 trainees, pilot trainees, are similar to other groups, and I have no reason to think you're not, unfortunately 2 of you will die in the course of the next year. Training took about a year, and he said every year on an average 2 pilot trainees die somehow or other in that training program. We take safety very seriously. We do whatever we can, but some years that nobody dies, but some years 3 or 4 people die. So on average 2 people die. And anyway, my mechanic, my client, said to me, and sure enough, over the course of that year, 2 of the pilots died in various kind of training accidents. And he said, that experience gave him a whole different perspective on things, and that is, which I would now call the meaning of it. In other words, the meaning to him was that no matter what you do, you can't totally prevent something like this from happening. And in fact, he would have phrased it like this: No matter what you do, planes crash and people die. You can be as careful as you want, you can do everything you can, but no matter what you do, inevitably, planes crash and people die. And the meaning to him then of this Northwest Flight 255 was the same thing, that no matter what you do, you try, still it's going to happen. And I began to think about that and actually contrast it with everybody else's. The meaning is it's much more horrendous and awful and terrible, and it shouldn't happen, and it's a nightmare. It's not something that's part of the course of what he expects would happen in everyday life. But we don't think it's something that would ever happen in the course of everyday life, but he did. So it began to become clear that it was that different meaning, that planes crash and people die, that led to him having the meaning, then led him to be less traumatized than everybody else. But you might say, okay, but what about the fact that he was irritable and angry? That's a trauma symptom. Why? That's a negative mood, actually. Maybe I should have mentioned that before. Under negative mood, he was irritable and angry. And so he told me that story too. And it turns out, unlike my guess, was that he was simply irritable and angry from the trauma of the crash, was that he said that he used to work for Republic Airlines. And Republic Airlines was bought up by Northwest only 1 or 2 years before this incident happened. And he said that he really liked, and Republic was a small regional airline in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, New Jersey. And he said he really liked working for Republic Airlines. It was a good company, it was a small company. He felt that the executives really had the well-being of their employees as a central motivation, and it was a good place to work. But once Republic was bought up by Northwest, then they became part of the big cold corporation. And Northwest Airlines, which was bought up by Delta maybe 10 years ago, so it's not around anymore, but Northwest Airlines back then, and United and American now, I don't know if you know anybody who works for any of those airlines, but the employees all hate them. They hate them. They feel like they are treated poorly. They've had their salaries and pay cut, that the company is just interested in the bottom line and doesn't care about the employees, and that he felt that way about Northwest. So for him, he worked in a really good place to work, Republic Airlines, and then they were swallowed up in the big cold corporation, Northwest, and his supervisor at work, was a long-time Northwest employee. So symbol of Northwest to him. And he felt, the mechanic, my client, the mechanic felt, that the reason for the crash was probably that Northwest's safety procedures were not adequate. He felt that at Republic they did a much better job of checking over the airplanes and making sure everything was okay. And that at Northwest the bottom line was money, so that the safety checks were not as thorough and not as well done. And it was, in his mind, Northwest Airlines' fault that one of their planes had crashed. Now we know later, and you know that I mentioned in the previous video, that it turned out to be that the pilots had not extended the flaps on takeoff, and the warning system that should have warned them about that had been disconnected. But that came out much later. In this case, he felt that it was Northwest's fault that all those people had died, and that's why he was angry at his supervisor. So he went back to work. I followed up with him. We just met either 2 or 3 times, and he was doing well. And the postscript of this story, again, this is the power of meaning, is that it so happened that at that time, in my private practice, I was working at the University of Michigan Psychiatric Emergency Services at the time, but I also had a small private practice. And at that time, I had a client who I knew vaguely, we never talked about it, but I knew vaguely he had been a pilot in the military. And so next time I saw him, I asked him about that, and he said, oh yeah, that was the same thing. And in his training class, 2 or 3 people had died in the training. And then finally, there's another plane crash I sometimes talk about in this course, which was United Flight 232, which crashed in July 1989 in a cornfield in Iowa and led to a movie and everything like that. But the part of it I just want to mention right now is that there was a newspaper story in the Trib, years ago, about the movie that was made about this flight. And as a part of the movie, or as part of the newspaper story, the reporter found a half a dozen people who had been on the actual crash and survived. In that crash, a bigger plane, something like 125 people died, but about 125 people lived as well. That the reporter interviewed some of those people, and one of the people he interviewed was a guy named Charlie Martz. And Charlie Martz was a former Navy jet pilot. Okay, there it is. And let me read from the article. As a Navy jet pilot, the cable television broker from a Denver suburb knew the aircraft was in serious trouble long before most of the other passengers did. When it crashed, he found he couldn't save the 80-year-old woman sitting next to him. As he walked out of the rear of the plane, he saw a blue-eyed girl whose feet had been ripped from her legs, staring lifeless at the sun, and also a man with a huge hole in his head who was also dead. But he was back in the air less than a week later. Now, 63, Martz has no nightmares, did not become religious. Earlier in the story they talked about how in the real plane crash, some people became religious and some people lost their religion. He did not become religious. He continues to fly planes himself, small planes himself, and he lives quite contentedly with his wife of 37 years and their 3 children. He did see a psychologist for about a month after the crash to deal with his feelings of guilt at not being able to save the woman next to him who died of smoke inhalation. And this goes back, if you recall, to factors in the more in the individual that affect the impact of a trauma, and that is a lack of ability to do anything, lack of being able to help people, lack of being able to make an impact, lack of being able to help other people. He said he has become more aware of his mortality, but his main thought is, quote, "Accidents happen, airplanes break," unquote, Martz said. Quote, "Sometimes I forget about it. It certainly doesn't change your life that much. I enjoy my life, and I hopefully will continue to enjoy my life for another 20 years. So, and in this article, they contrast what he says with most of the other passengers that were interviewed by the reporter who were totally traumatized, who were going to support groups, who were seeing therapists, who had physical injuries. So just again, another example about, I bet that he also had that different meaning, and it comes out in that quote. The different meaning for him is similar to my mechanic for Northwest Airline. Accidents happen, airplanes break, no matter how hard you try, there's nothing you can do about it. Okay, so an interesting case and an example of the power of meaning, that different meanings of events are going to produce a whole different impact on the individual in question. Okay, so that's the case of the airline mechanic, and I'll see you next time.